we are already seeing signs, and we were warning in that paper that, there are already indications that if something is not drastically done ASAP, Uganda would be experiencing the resource curse in the same way as Nigeria. So, back to your question now, what we're dealing with is one, first, distinguish a country that is mature from a country that is emerging. And then specifically in Nigeria, we've seen the weakness of the regulatory infrastructure. We've seen issues of conflict of interest. We've seen the concerns around transparency, and we've seen concerns relating to the political and social landscape within the country. And more concerning is that issue of corruption and the absence of a strategic energy vision.
On today's episode, I'm going to be having a conversation with Dr. Eddy Wifa about energy security and energy transition in Africa. Dr. Wifa is an energy law lecturer at the University of Aberdeen here in Scotland. He earned a law degree from Rivers State University in Nigeria and was admitted to Nigerian Bar in 2012. He subsequently went on to obtain a master's degree in oil and gas law with distinction at University of Aberdeen. He then proceeded to obtain a PhD in offshore marine renewable energy risk governance, also at University of Aberdeen. He was a senior partner at Ascendo Juris, a Nigerian law firm. However, currently, Dr. Wifa devotes his time exclusively to teaching and research in Aberdeen University. His research interests include risk governance, petroleum and natural resource governance, regulatory theories in high major risk industries, decommissioning, and clean energy regulation. Dr. Wifa is the director at African Natural Resources and Energy Law Network. He's also a director at Aberdeen Research Group, and he is the editorial assistant for the African Journal of International Energy and Environmental Law. I'm so grateful and delighted to welcome Dr. Wifa to the podcast. Dr. Eddy Wifa, welcome to the Pan-African Experience.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure, and well done on such a wonderful work you're doing. Well done.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. One of the first book I read when I first came to the UK is The Oil Cost by Michael Lewin-Ross, and obviously for most people who haven't read it, it's a book that explored how countries with mineral resources, how those mineral resources have impacted them, positively or negatively, and how they can turn it from a curse into a blessing, and that pretty much brought me to the topic of discussion today with regards to energy transition, energy security and energy transition. And but before we delve into this, I was wondering, what inspired you to go into this area of study? Because you have a background in oil and gas and also renewable energy.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Again, thank you for having me. Fantastic question. I mean, I come from Nigeria, and I'm particularly from a region known as Ogoni. And Ogoni is a small community that produces a lot of the oil that Nigeria enjoys within the Niger Delta region. And growing up, I saw how, we would travel for, Christmas or holidays. And, there was nothing to, other than, of course, traditionally the beautiful, relatives and the farmlands. We would go to the farm. There wasn't light. There wasn't, clean drinking water. There weren't decent schools. There weren't, absolutely nothing people within that region could hold on to. And to make matters worse, even the little farmlands that they had was increasingly polluted by environmental oil spills. And I remember one of those situations when there was an explosion in one of the flow stations not too far from my place. And, if you wore a white shirt, you would basically see, oil wherever you were. And this was what people needed to live, the conditions people found themselves. And towards people live with that, and at some point, the community couldn't have it anymore, and so they had this, activist Ken Saro-Wiwa, who then, was speaking. He was an enlightened guy, had published, was, lived in Europe as well as Nigeria. And so he was speaking against this level of environmental degradation and the resource curse, like you've rightly hinted. Rather than listen and rather than negotiate, rather than prefer solutions, rather than design a compensation scheme that would resolve some of these issues that were highlighted, unfortunately, a kangaroo court was set up, and himself and 9 others were killed. 8 others were killed. And so if you just Google the killing of Ogoni 9, you can't miss it. It's topical. Until this day, there are court cases and court battles that refer to that situation. Now, most people know only of the killings of the Ogoni 9, but what people don't realize is that close to 2,000 people were killed by the Nigerian military under Abacha, General Sani Abacha. And that was because they thought killing the people will quieten the agitations and the activism. But the reality is, like Ken Saro-Wiwa said, you can kill the messenger, but you cannot kill the message. It actually got worse because the next generation of activists felt that, it's no longer the talking and negotiations that Ken Saro-Wiwa was doing. They then formed militia groups. And that's why today we have the movement for emancipation of the Niger Delta and a number of other military groups within the region, blowing up pipelines, kidnapping foreign workers, and even, oil company workers. And indeed, the situations have gotten worse. There was an amnesty program that sort of quieted down a few people, but we still know that there are pockets of these agitations and, militarization of the region in a number of ways. So that, living through that, without going too deep, living through that, as a young boy, seeing all of that, I said, I will study law. I couldn't stand for injustice. And that's why I studied law. And once I became a lawyer, the next thing was, where do I go from here? I had to go into researching, and I found out that, University of Aberdeen was one of those very top-notch schools that could provide me insights into the study of oil and gas. And so I did my master's in oil and gas law. But as you would see, the government, the society, the world indeed is transitioning in a number of ways, or indeed transforming its energy structures. I then sort of did my PhD. I was fortunate to get a PhD scholarship to do my PhD in offshore wind health and safety risk governance. So my research largely has been person or human-centered, be it oil and gas, when I looked at resource governance, resource curse, and all of those things, and even energy transition when I look at wind more specifically, with a focus on the health and safety implications of renewable energy in the offshore environment.
Wow, that's really extensive. And with regards to energy security, I was wondering, when we say energy security, what do we mean when we say energy security?
Yeah, absolutely. Energy security in this sense is like, it's like security in any form. If you say you lived in your house and you're secure, it means you're not particularly worried. Again, I'm using trying to explain it in the simplest term because, just so that whoever is listening to this will be able to catch it. If you say you're secure, financially secure, or in any way, it means you don't have the worries that people would ordinarily have. And so it means you are secure. And if you're insecure financially or otherwise, or even energy, it means that there are a lot of things you're worried about. And when it comes to worrying, and energy security more specifically, you're particularly concerned about accessibility of the energy, and accessibility and availability of the energy. So on one hand, is it available? And two, is it accessible? It could be available, but it may not be accessible because it could be like Nigeria right there in front of you, but you cannot access it either in form of utilizing it, using your money to purchase it, and all of those things. And that kind of leads to energy poverty concerns that you see within the continent. So, for instance, about 633 million people do not have access to energy. And so once you begin to understand that, it means, they are dealing with energy poverty. So energy security, energy insecurity in those sense is really, really fundamental to growth, to development in a number of ways. And it then leads you from energy security to what we then call the energy trilemma, which is perhaps giving it that three-pronged approach, in the sense that you're looking at energy security on one hand, you're looking at also energy accessibility, but you're then also looking at those environmental concerns that may be, that may be embedded within the energy question, and that's the issue of again, energy sustainability. But in fact, the issues have even become further complex, because there's now the energy quadrilemma, which has led to a fourth strand of not just accessibility, not just availability or the power to purchase it, not just environmental sustainability, but even the social acceptance of energy infrastructure. And so you would see that even if you're building wind turbines, you then need to put into consideration what are those factors or barriers that would enable or will hinder the development of that renewable energy source. And that's why you start having this idea of not in my backyard syndrome, where people say we want the green energy, but we don't want it in our backyard because it will devalue our properties. There are a lot of risks involved if there's a blade failure, for instance, if it's wind, and so you get that. So the question is then, the fourth question is then one of social acceptability. Is it socially acceptable? It's green, but do you have people opposing to even the greenest of energy sources? So it's moved on, and it's difficult to have energy security conversations in isolation without thinking of all these other factors that are indeed, I must stress, indeed fundamental.
Well, so I mean, one of the courses that you teach is petroleum resource governance, and like every layman in Africa, including me, the question we always ask is, for example, in Nigeria, we have oil and gas, we have these resources. How come we don't have, there's always no petrol in the pumps? People are queuing all the time. There's black market for petrol, and the country is not really benefiting from these resources. I don't want to say Nigeria is poor, but I don't think it's living up to the full potential of getting access to these resources. What can we attribute this to?
I mean, there are a number of factors. So first, you're dealing with a supposedly mature oil and gas jurisdiction, and I'd like to distinguish a country like Nigeria that is, supposedly mature. I would say Nigeria, Libya, some of these countries fall into that category. They've been exploring for oil since, say, 1960s. All right. And so they should have a significant amount of experience. I like to distinguish that sort of country from a country like Mozambique, Tanzania, and even Ghana, Uganda, some of these new entrants. There's the need to draw the distinction, because on one hand, a country like Nigeria is dealing with fundamental structural governance issues, as well as indeed regulatory. From a regulatory standpoint, you would understand that it wasn't until 2021, just a month or two ago, that the entire petroleum industry regulatory regime was overhauled. And this is a country that started oil exploration in commercial quantity as way back as, I think, 1960. Actually, 1958, that the first commercial lift was done. And it's in 2021, right, that it's then overhauling its regulatory infrastructure. And so you begin to ask yourself, what did it do for the last 6-7 decades? What was wrong? That's from a regulatory standpoint. So we saw that within the regulation itself, there were issues of, for instance, conflict of interest. There wasn't a clear strategy in terms of maximizing the economic recovery from oil. And then on a strong structural level, you then had those issues of, corruption, mismanagement of resources, and the lack of energy strategic planning. So there wasn't, a clear vision as to this is the resource, this is where we want to get to at XYZ. And so there was that lack of vision, lack of strategic planning. Indeed, corruption played a significant role, and there was this sort of elitist ideology to utilizing or mismanaging the resource, I would say. And so you distinguish that from a country like Uganda. And I've just published a book chapter with a colleague looking at how to predict some of the issues you've identified. So we looked at Nigeria and Namibia and tried to identify what are those factors that could help emerging oil and gas jurisdictions to predict the likelihood of experiencing the resource curse. Because 10 years ago, Ghana was saying, we would not experience the resource curse. We would not be like Nigeria. Fast forward to now, there are concerns, that they are falling into the same trap. And so I said, why don't we look at a country like Uganda that is expecting to lift oil in commercial quantity between 2022 and 2023 and see if we are able to predict the prevalence or the existence of the resource curse. And some of our conclusions suggest that there are already those factors that would exacerbate the resource cost within that country. So you need to ask, fundamental questions around transparency. That's indeed fundamental. And our research sort of suggested that there are concerns around transparency in that region. You start looking at things around corruption. You start having some of those concerns as well. You start looking at some of the conflicts, small internal or regional conflicts within those regions. Those are the sort of things that, once oil comes in, it even escalates some of the very, very little conflicts, because sometimes in most cases people then have access to the resources and then they use the money to to get arms and all of those things. So we are already seeing signs, and we were warning in that paper that there are already indications that if something is not drastically done ASAP, Uganda would be experiencing the resource curse in the same way as Nigeria. So back to your question now, what we're dealing with is, one, first, distinguish a country that is mature from a country that is emerging. And then specifically in Nigeria, we've seen the weakness of the regulatory infrastructure. We've seen issues of conflict of interest. We've seen the concerns around transparency, and we've seen concerns relating to the political and social landscape within the country. And more concerning is that issue of corruption and the absence of a strategic energy vision.
So I was wondering, this resource curse, and you talked about the existing conflicts and division, these resources might exacerbate it. So is there any mitigating factors? Is there something that a country like Uganda can do now to avoid falling into this pothole, so to speak?
I mean, unfortunately, one of the things that I find lacking is within the global South is this inability to be honest. And as simple as that sounds, a lot of the governance structures within the energy sector is dependent largely on a certain level of sincerity of purpose. If the purpose is not clear and sincere, then you're absolutely wasting your time. So what I try to advise governments, and I've done that in a number of organizations or forums and even countries, is that can we first have a very honest conversation about the issues? Can we keep everything aside, keep sentiments? Can we have a normal, decent conversation? And that is fundamental in any relationship. Because what we are seeing, whether you want to call it resource curse or you all call it oil sector governance, what we are dealing with here is principally a relationship between the citizens and the leadership or the political elites. And if there isn't a clear conversation about that, then we are bloody wasting our time. So if you look at a country like Norway that people like to use as example, they have the 10 commandments. of the oil and gas industry, right? It sounds like a movie, but if you go online and just Google the 10 commandments of the Norwegian oil and gas industry, it's absolutely clear. And that's a commandment that the country sat down together to say, forget all the technical, jargons and what people will put into laws and policy and whatever. Whatever we say must be hinged on these 10 commandments. And everybody, from the children to the adult, know that there's a 10 commandment. And it's like anything in life, that you need those fundamental principles that we can relate to. And then we from there begin to structure our energy governance system to feed and support and enhance the outcomes that we've very well outlined. So for instance, I can send you a link to the Norwegian oil website, where you would actually see the money from oil. You can see on a per second, on a microsecond basis, the money is increasing. It adds every microsecond. You can see it go peep, 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 and you see the money's increasing. I can open the website here. And anybody in Norway has access to it. He just needs to click on it and he knows, oh, as a Norwegian, this is our money. We see it adding. And if we say we don't want this relationship anymore and we say share all our money, this is what we're going to get. Maybe an average of 80,000 euros or 80,000 pounds per person. So it's as fundamental as first having a very sincere conversation about what we want to do, what we want to achieve with the resources, and then begin to design your governance structures to achieve that. So for instance, in a country like Nigeria, we're talking about subsidies and how much we're subsidizing and how many, that's not even a conversation we have, the facts or the details. And on one hand, we are subsidizing, and sometimes someone else may come, oh, no, we have not, we've removed it. And after a while, you see them come back to the conversation again, and you're wondering, what are we really doing? There's that absence of sincerity in our energy governance structure. And that's why without it, it goes to the root of all of this. Without it, we cannot plan. And if you cannot plan, you are already doomed to fail. And when I say planning, I don't mean all this flowery language and policies, vision this, vision that, and people throw things here and there. I mean, actual planning with expected outcomes and measures to check those objectives that and ensure that they are met from time to time. So for a country like Uganda, in these very early phases, we're already seeing, when you look at the political scenario within the country, you can already see that there are tensions here and there. Look at the last elections. There were concerns being raised as to, do people have freedom, to elect whoever they want? And those are fundamental things that needs to be discussed. A democracy is not necessarily just running elections. And those are things that go to the root of your resource structures. If people don't have the confidence that they can vote and have their votes counted, and they can change government at will, whenever they don't like government, then the whole basis for even resource distribution and governance is we're just wasting our time. That's because there's no accountability and there are no consequences. So you look at that, you start looking at the role of the watchdogs, the things like the journalism, things like the non-governmental organizations. What power do they have? Can they even speak? Can they speak on behalf of the people? And you feel that to a very large extent, we don't have that sort of activism or stakeholder engagement in the decision-making process. Then we are also wasting our time. So those are things. Then you start looking at, those internal voices of concerns. Are they being heard? So beyond the designing of a sophisticated governance structure, the principal ingredients would be fundamentally missing if you don't take that. So the lack of transparency, I can't stress that enough. And that's why we now have the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative that was introduced by Tony Blair. and has gone become really indeed popular. But you see, even countries that have adopted it have still not even made the most of it. So it's one thing to adopt it, but it's another thing to have them, work as it should. So things like transparency, things like stakeholder engagement and participation, the role of non-NGOs and if they are actively involved, education, even educating the people so that they are aware about what their rights are and where their resources are and where it's going. That is increasingly, fundamental to all of this. And then the democratic process. Once you've gone past that, all right, then we can now start discussing more substantive issues of, the local content structure within the government, discussing things like the oil redistribution processes, what mechanisms do you have to redistribute the resources, and how are we, managing those channels? Other than that, I think it's just all a joke.
You're very familiar with the legal aspect of oil and gas industry, and I was wondering, from my limited knowledge in this sector, in the UK, I don't think an individual can own an oil block or something of that nature. But in Nigeria, there's so many people that I believe that own oil blocks in Nigeria. And that boils down to that accountability and governance structure. What you've been talking about. Can this be contributing to lack of accountability as well if it becomes a personal business?
So again, the problem really is not even who owns the oil block.
Okay.
Because, the first thing is, what's the ownership structure? So for instance, in the US, if I find there's oil, in my backyard, I basically own it. It's if there's oil underneath my house, I would call a company and say, you know what, do you want to buy this? I can privately negotiate. They have a completely different land law system. It's not the same in the UK. Okay, it's completely different in the UK. If you go offshore, it's the Gulf of Mexico. It's the government that owns it. But onshore, it's anyone who finds it or who has access or who bought the land owns what is underneath, the land. In the UK, it's completely different. The Crown owns these things. Okay, the Crown owns the resources. The Crown owns what we find offshore. So the first thing is, when you find oil, the question you need to be asking yourself is, what kind of legal model do I want to use in extracting the resources? You may choose for instance, a licensing regime, in which case you give a private company, the license. It doesn't matter who the company is. Of course, there are criteria for giving a license. You're looking at a company that is well established, that has the resources, that has the technical feasibility, that has the reputation, all of those things. So you tick all those boxes, and then you give the companies, based on either a bidding system, the right to exploit for the resources. What happens is, when the oil comes out of the ground in a licensing regime, the oil belongs to the company. Okay, the oil company owns the oil. You, the government, nobody has a say. Now, what happens is, you then have to have a sophisticated tax regime or process to take your own share of the profit, because he owns the oil, but he will have to pay tax and all of those things for the oil he has extracted. You may choose to use something called a production sharing agreement, which is a company bears all the risk of finding if there is oil in the ground. And when they find it, they knock on your door and say, hello, government, I found that there's a lot of oil here. How do you want us to share it? And you say, oh, anyway, for all your troubles, you take 40% and I take 60%, or you take 20% and I take 80%, all of those things. That's what you and the companies negotiate, right? Now, it could be any company. It could be you, it could be me. Once we have all of that, so fundamentally, it's not. Some people, like in Brazil, they have a service contract regime where basically the government calls a company to basically, like, you will build your house, right? A service contract system. Build this house or drill this oil for me. This is what we'll be paying you, monthly, or, this is how we will pay you. And you have no interest, no right whatsoever. But then in that case, the government bears all the risk. Now, because resources are very thin, okay? Resources are very thin, particularly in Africa and some of these the global South countries. They cannot bear that risk. So most times you would see African countries opt for a production sharing contract regime where the government will just hand over all the risks to the companies, and they would in some cases sit back, and when the oil is found, then they would share the resources. Now, this is where it gets tricky. If you do not have the knowledge, the understanding, and the negotiation power to stand before global giants, multinational oil companies, to reach a deal that is long-term, it's proactive, it's visionary, you would have these companies make a mess of you. They will insert clauses that would make you, lose. At the end of the day, you will run at a loss. They may take a large percentage of the resources and give you absolutely nothing. You may have a 60-40 ratio, but in reality, they may be taking more because they then add extra cost to whatever it is they're doing. And then, at the end of the day, you thought you made a good deal, but no, you didn't. So, it then makes people ask the question, before we get into oil exploration as a country, do we need to see how we can build local capacity and knowledge just so that we can, at least know what these companies are doing and follow them accordingly. But that's a question, we can deal with. But because of the pressure, and again, the priorities of these countries in such a way that the priority is, if I, as the head of state, am already I get a good share, it almost doesn't matter what really is negotiated. Do you understand?
Yes.
Because the priority is not the entire country. The priority is one man. And if one man sees, $1 billion entering his account, he thinks that's a huge amount of money. But in reality, if the country was the priority, then he would have to negotiate something that will be suitable, and he can say, within the next 10 years, we will build our capacity, we'll get to this level, and local content would have been developed and all of that. But the priority is not the people. The priority in most cases is the individual. And so 1 billion looks huge to him. But by the time he has to build roads and build schools, there's absolutely nothing. He doesn't have the system, he doesn't have the resources, he doesn't have the infrastructure. And then the companies are smiling to the bank. Wow. So it's a question of, what is your priority at the time you discover oil? And what point are you negotiating from? If you're negotiating from a place of weakness, you're going to basically accept almost anything that is thrown at you. If you're negotiating from a place of strength, like Norway, they can tell any company to go to hell because they actually have one of the strongest oil companies in the world, Ecuador. Wow. So it's a question of where your priority lies.
You mentioned the Norwegian 10 Commandments. Can you briefly touch on that a little bit? Because I've been curious. It's been going around in my head a little bit. Just if you can briefly touch on that.
It says the 10 oil commandments. Okay. 1, national supervision and control must be ensured for all operations on the Norwegian continental shelf. National supervision and control. So when Shell, for instance, got their first license, right, back in 1958, they got a license to bore and explore for oil in the entire country without any limitations whatsoever. If you read the history of Nigerian oil and gas. And I make a joke sometimes that if at 1958 Shell got the license to exploit for oil in the entire country, are we surprised that we then got independence in 1960, 2 years after? What that tells you is, although the search for oil has started back in 1908, some people say 1906, but because of war and all of those things, they couldn't really, get ahead or get the commercial quantity they needed. But it was until 1958 that the oil was, discovered in commercial, and the first commercial lift was done in 1958. It was 2 years after that Nigeria got independence. If you think deeply, it means that, I see you're laughing. It means that they got what they wanted right? Which was the oil, and to support industrialization and all of those things. And then they handed over the independence to you. So while we were rejoicing for independence, the main, the main reason for being there had been achieved because they had the license to explore for oil all over the country. So in terms of control, the control was largely in a private company at that time. So the second, petroleum discoveries must be exploited in a way which makes Norway as independent as possible of others for its supplies of crude oil, energy security. But it must be exploited in a way that makes Norway independent. So look at a country like Nigeria, certainly not independent. They take the crude oil, send it out, then import refined petroleum.
That blows my mind. The idea that you export.
I don't know. So you're not independent. You're absolutely not independent. And even the crude oil itself is largely controlled by joint venture partners that are steered by international companies. And that's why you can see the foundations. It's not big, it's not big, sophisticated language in a law. I'm just reading 10 commandments. And the entire oil and gas regime in Norway is dependent on these 10. So the question is, if you look at Commandment 1, what do we do in the law to make sure that happens? You look at Commandment 2, what do we do in the law to make sure that happens? And you follow through. Let me read 3. New industry will be developed on the basis of petroleum. So they use petroleum to develop other industries. So they took the money for petroleum to diversify. And that's why Equinor is one of the front runners when it comes to offshore wind today. They export the oil, but the entire energy from Norway, 98 to 99%, is gotten from hydropower, clean energy. The entire energy from the country. Yeah, they have all the oil, but they sent it all away and they're not burning it in their country. I mean, do you understand? So, and I tell people that in life, people have made the mistakes that you don't need to repeat. You don't need to repeat it. People have done these things ahead of you. So why not learn from them? Okay. So number 4, the development of an oil industry must take necessary account of existing industrial activities and the protection of nature and the environment. So they prioritize the environment. And it's not like, we had an oil spill that lasted 32 days in Bayelsa in Nigeria, in the Niger Delta region. And it was just spilling for 32 days. If it happened in this country, if it happened in any other country in the world, it would be top news. It's not even something people are losing sleep over. For 32 days, oil was spilling on cap. Look at the Macondo disaster. It was 80-something days that the oil was spilling for because of the failure of a blowout preventer. How much did it cost BP? It cost them $62 billion.
In compensation.
In compensation, in research, in all of those things, to cap it and all of that. $62 billion. The Ogoni oil spill, following from the UNEP report, after over 50 years of oil degradation, was $1 billion. Do you understand? $1 billion. That was going to be funded by government, and the oil companies and all that. That was $1 billion. After 50 years of oil degradation. Compared to 87 days or so, 60 billion. And then now we have the Nambe oil spill, 32 days uncapped. Begin to ask yourself, what am I missing here? So they prioritize the environment. Flaring of exploitable gas on the North Sea, on major continental shelf must not be accepted except during brief periods of testing. So no gas flaring. You don't try unless for testing and all of that. Petroleum from the Norwegian continental shelf must, as a general rule, be landed in Norway except in those cases where socio-political considerations dictate a different solution. So the oil must land on their soil. 7, the state must become involved at all appropriate levels of and contribute to the coordination of Norwegian interests in Norway's petroleum industry, as well as the creation of an integral oil community which sets its sights both nationally and internationally. So they are saying that their oil company, Start Oil, it was before, now Equinor, must be involved at every level. At every level. So we begin to ask ourselves, how powerful have our national oil companies become? Be it in Senegal, be it NNPC, be it in Ghana, name it. How powerful? We are not close. In fact, we are defaulting on cash calls and we don't have the technical expertise, and it's indeed troubling. It's indeed troubling. How are they partnering with our universities and our schools? I was in Norway last month for a project, and I was at the University of Bergen. And you see the oil companies and the universities and the school and the education system working together to solve local problems. But when it comes to, countries in Africa, they fly 10, 15 people to Houston or Dubai for a training, and they go there, have fun, and they are back. And they pay the money to whoever, some, contracted to some company or training academy, wherever, somewhere abroad. And then we are back to square one. It's shameful. Why aren't we partnering with our universities and funding that? And so 9, so if you go to 8, it says a state oil company will be established which can look after the government's commercial interests. All right? Look after the interest and pursue appropriate collaboration with domestic and foreign oil interests. So you see a very powerful, so they design it for that purpose. It's very clear that the priority of the state oil company is to look at the interest of the government. It has nothing else. It can partner, it can collaborate, but its interest, its priority is the government. So all the decisions are geared towards what the country needs. 9, a pattern of activities must be selected north of the 62nd parallel, with which reflects the special socio-political conditions prevailing in that part of the country. So they take care of every part of the country and make sure that, everybody, Norway, they are rich. That's why it's a very expensive country, to be in. And then 10, large Norwegian petroleum discoveries could present new tasks for Norway's foreign policy. So they use it as a negotiation tool, by and large. They use it as a negotiation tool, just so that, they are able to maximize not just the resources itself, but they are able to make the most of it. So that was just to point you, because some people, when you talk about these things, people don't get it. They think, you're making these things up, but these things exist. I will send you the link, to the website for the Norwegian this thing, where if you just click on the link, you would see the money. If I'm not with the link here, but if you click on it, you'd see the money live.
Yeah, I think one issue with African countries, especially Nigeria, is nobody's acting on the interest of the country. Everybody's acting on individual interest, self-interest, self-preservation, which is very sad. And to some extent, I don't really blame this company. There's companies that are taking advantage of Nigeria. It takes two to tango with regards to corruption. I know it's easy for Western countries to say, "Oh, Nigeria is corrupt," but it takes two to tango. It takes two people to engage in corruption.
No. So let's face it. Oil companies are like babies, right? They will take as much as you give. Let's not be, fooled. They would take as much as you can give. They are commercial entities. Their interests are, completely different. It's left for you to play, the ball to your side. You can't be scoring own goals and expect the other team to say, No, no, don't score yourself. No, it doesn't happen. We can have a conversation around, doing things ethically, and all of those sort of things. But by and large, it's a commercial company, it's a commercial entity. The priority is profit, and they have to maximize those profits as much as they can. So ask yourself, isn't the same company operating in other parts of the world and making profit? They're operating.
Yeah.
They're in the UK. That same company is in the UK and they're making profit under more stringent conditions. Those companies are in Norway. They are making profits. They are in US. They are making profits. So we need to start,
So we have to look within more.
You have to look inward. Let's not kid ourselves. It's embarrassing sometimes when you have these conversations, and I try to, I'm in most cases I get reluctant to speak about some of these things because it's depressing. It's depressing. It's you looking at 50, 60 years of stupidity. We need to call it what it is. 50, 60 years of stupidity is like any form of security. Look at Boko Haram. You watch it in that region year in, year out, day in, day out, crippling the entire system. The same way we've watched our oil and gas industry year in, year out, only enriching a few, and have people live in the most deplorable situation amidst wealth, unimaginable wealth. That's not a question of law. That is just a question of people being clearly evil. And so even if the colonial masters may have left, we are worse than the colonial masters. And when people try to use colonialism as an excuse, I just say, shut up. We are worse to ourselves. How can I sit here? And my European counterparts and colleagues have been to more African countries than I have been to? And they can wake up and go to South Africa now. They can wake up and go to Kenya, forget about COVID and all of those things. When things were, they can go to any African country. I, as an African, I cannot. They don't need a visa. I, as an African, I sometimes tell my colleagues, some of the African countries you guys have been to, I haven't even been to half of the countries you have been to. And we're talking about looking inward. To where? We are killing ourselves. And I have to wait until maybe I've been in this country long enough and have become maybe a citizen or have a permanent residency before I can then easily travel to Africa. Is that not madness? So they value the passport of the Europeans and the British and the US and the Americans more than they would value my Nigerian passport. They do that. And you say, why hasn't Africa grown? Where is the role of Pan-Africanism? Where is the role of regionalism? You see these countries working in blocks in EU, working together. Because one problem affects me, it will affect us. Where is our regional integration? How do we trade with one another? How do we share expertise and knowledge? Whether be it oil, be it anything. We should be able to work together. But no. So we've failed in some of the most fundamental and the most basic things. Before you even start, if you failed in the most basic things, then how can you then deal with the more complex, sophisticated issues of, technology transfer, patent integration, regional cooperation within the energy systems and all of that. Because if ECOWAS as a region worked together and had an integrated energy system where they can build wind turbines everywhere and build the transmission stations anywhere where the most of the resources are and sell it and give it to the other guys, we will be powered. Guys that are by the coast, they build offshore wind turbines. The guys that are landlocked, they build onshore. The guys that have more sun, they build more sun. The guys that have more sunlight and land and space, we build it more, and then we integrate all of them together. That's what happens. Denmark is building an energy island. It's not building it for Denmark. It's building it for Germany and all of those countries around, so that Germany does not always need to rely on Russia for gas. What are we saying? It's not, this is commonsensical. These are just normal things. And they say, oh, if we do this and we do this, it means this would happen and that will happen. Okay, what do we need? And then we start working around what we need. And they start small and they learn from it, you know, and then they develop. And in 10, 20, 30 years, boom, the whole world is like, whoa, where did that come from? No, they didn't start now. The first offshore wind turbine was built over 30 years ago in Denmark. It was just a very tiny thing. Now, one wind turbine is powering hundreds or even 1,000 or more homes from just within 30 years. Look at Dubai. Look at China in the last 50 years. It's not rocket science. It's just a question of what do we really want? And then how do we get it? And then we work together and we achieve it. And we keep trying and we keep trying and we keep trying and we keep trying until it's done. It's not rocket science. Why do they make it feel like these guys are performing magic here? No, you and I are here. We've seen them. We've been in classes with them. We've been in conference with them. We've been in boardrooms with them. These guys are not performing magic. They're normal.
Just having a simple governance structure and sticking to, what you want to do.
That is all.
I wanted to say something. I wanted to say something because I know this can be frustrating. And you mentioned about colonialism, and and I completely understand what you're saying, but I don't want someone listening to this feeling that we are ignoring the impact of colonialism, because there are some colonial pacts, there are some colonial contracts that were signed before that handover was done. You were talking about Shell, whatever that is in that agreement could have been for 100 years or maybe for 50 years or whatever it is. But that, once we acknowledge that there are still some post-colonial systems in place still in these African countries that are still stifling them, using the Francophone countries, former French colonies, for example. France is, pretty much putting these countries on chokehold with regards to their, monetary system and all elements of their economy. However, that said, let's assume that this country are taking 50% of these resources. Let's assume, this is just a number I plucked out of my head. Then that 50% that is still left is still being mismanaged by these African countries, because out of that 50%, 49.999% will go into personal pockets of these countries. When Abacha died, there's so much money was left outside the country. This is where I always say that it takes two to tango with regards to corruption. David Cameron was recorded in a hot mic telling the Queen, I'm speaking with Nigerian president, is one of the most corrupt countries in the world.
No, Nigeria and Afghanistan are possibly the two most corrupt countries. But this particular president is actually not corrupt. No, he's trying very hard.
They are coming at their own expense.
I mean, yes. There's going to be slightly because it's an anti-corruption summit. Everything has to be open.
In an apparent reference to the anti-corruption conference he's hosting in London later this week, he can be heard telling the Queen that we've got the leaders of some fantastically corrupt countries coming to Britain.
But most of these leaders looted money ends up in the UK, in America, Switzerland, and they're not saying anything. So they're using it to develop these systems here with looted money, but they're not really holding these people accountable. So I just wanted to point that out.
Let me also explain another thing. When our corrupt I'll give you an example. If I come to squat in your house and I say, oh, Suchima, I don't have a house. Can I stay with you for a while? And in staying with you, I'm squatting in one of the rooms. But then after a week or two, you see me drive maybe a Range Rover. The first thing that comes to your mind is, is everything okay? In fact, you would ask me if it belongs to someone else. And I said, no, I just bought that Range. It's a, latest model, 30, 40,000 pounds. You would think I must be mad. Because I'm squatting in your room and driving a Range Rover. Priorities. So when one of the Nigerian politicians was convicted in England over almost 20 years ago, or 15 to 20 years ago, and it wasn't until recently that 4-point-something million of his money that isn't up to 10% of what the government has was sent to Nigeria. And you could see the Nigerians, federal and state governments scrambling.
You're talking about James Ibori, former governor of...
Yes. The money that that was sent, part of the money he took, less than 10% was sent down to the country. And you can see the federal and the state arguing over who gets the money from one man. So when you begin to contextualize these issues, it gets increasingly frustrating that someone who is squatting is now the one showing off. And then you begin to lose even the goodwill. Do you understand me? You begin to lose the goodwill because if you didn't have food and you are driving a Range Rover and squatting in my house and you ask me, I will tell you that I think you must be mad. And you begin to lose goodwill. You lose goodwill and people begin to even take you for a greater ride. Let's call it what it is. People begin to take you for a ride. That this person doesn't have his head walked up properly. So we can trample on him. We can do whatever we want. Hey, guys, do you want to go there and, steal some more diamond? Do you want to go there and steal some more gold? These guys are crazy people. Don't worry. Give them a few things here and there and you would have your way. That's what they take you for. And they do that year in, year out. And for decades, we begin to ask ourselves, how did we get here? And the longer it has taken, the more difficult it is for us to come back. So if you look at energy transition and the conversation around it, you now begin to see how, on one hand, we are talking about resource curse, but on the other hand, we are now beginning to deal with energy injustices. With critical minerals for the batteries and all of those things required for energy transition is just being taken away with ease from countries in Africa, Congo, and all of that. And so in 20, 30, 40 years' time, when we have been blinded and haven't seen, we will start calling on the Chinas and co to help us build wind turbines. Because they've taken all the resources for our batteries, and now we did not get involved, so we are now begging them to save us. The same way they're saving with infrastructure in Africa and railway and all of those things we see us taking loans for. Yeah. So you don't need to go too far. It's quite troubling, but it's our reality.
Yeah, and you mentioned energy transition there briefly, and I believe one of the quickest way to achieve energy security in Africa, in African countries, is through diversifying the energy mix, increasing the energy mix. And another quick way of doing that is energy transitioning to renewable energy. And so Africa have like the environment for renewable energy to flourish, but I just wanted you to elaborate on energy transition, the concept of energy transition.
So let me first of all put it this way. And if this is the only thing I say during this interview, I am absolutely fine. there's a struggle here to find a balance. How do you explain to a country that has enormous, or a continent that has enormous deposits of fossil fuels, right? And yet is struggling with energy poverty, right? And then dealing with climate change. I saw on the news, I think it was BBC, there was a picture of about 6 giraffes this week that died from lack of water, drought in Kenya. And they're saying they are losing about 70% of the water in that region. They've lost. So Africa is caught in between. On one hand, dealing with the challenges and the concerns of energy poverty, energy crisis. On the other hand, dealing with the impact of climate change. So I had to investigate this thing even further. If Africa didn't have oil, or if countries in Africa didn't have oil and was dealing with energy poverty, I would understand. But we've had oil, some for decades, and are still dealing with energy poverty and energy accessibility. We have oil and gas. We're flaring the gas, blowing it, wasting it, and we're crying of energy poverty. So we need to tell ourselves the truth, that the problem is not the lack of the resources. Let's get that clear. For most of these, especially mature oil and gas jurisdictions, the problem is not the absence of the resources, that we are dealing with more fundamental energy or oil governance structures that are not in place, to the event that even if they shipped 1,000 wind turbines to our ports now, as you and I are talking, we will still in 10, 20 years, if those things that need to be solved are not solved, still be dealing with energy poverty. Let's stop kidding ourselves, because I've seen a lot of these conversations online and they make it as if we are dealing with oil versus renewable energy. No, that is not what the problem is. We are dealing with fundamental energy governance structures that have failed and have broken down. We are dealing with local content and lack of capacity that we didn't deal with. We are dealing with issues of transparency that we didn't deal with. We are dealing with issue of energy distribution that we didn't deal with. We are dealing with energy corruption that we didn't deal with. And we're dealing with having the wrong political climate that we didn't deal with. So it has nothing to do with energy, because you have the energy. I can't be a farmer and be crying out to the next door man to say I haven't eaten. He will think I am mad. He must think that this guy is mad. He has a farm, he has all the food, he has all the crops, but he says he's hungry. I think that guy must be mad. So that on one hand, and then we have to deal with climate change, which is biting Africa seriously. Seriously. The drought, the desertification, the flooding, we're seeing it. Heritage sites in Africa being impacted. And to make it worse, we are going to suffer the most. We are seeing migration. We are seeing migration. And because we are more vulnerable, because we don't have sophisticated systems. Some of these countries, if something is going to happen, they can detect it, they can predict it. We don't know when it's going to happen. So when it happens, it's going to have the greatest catastrophe. So why are we fooling ourselves? We are going to be greatly impacted by climate change. The emergency systems, response systems in some of these other countries are so sophisticated. They have the money. Look at what COVID did. I was thinking COVID will teach us a lesson, but look at what COVID did. Look at countries recovering. They have the money. They will borrow. They have goodwill. They will easily borrow the money. You, Africa, you cannot borrow the kind of money they are borrowing. So, back to the question. Is it a renewable energy versus an oil energy problem? No, it's not. And so until we begin to see energy security as national security, it has to be equated in the same way. Energy security as national security, climate security as national security. Then we need to wake up and then begin to be strategic in our planning. So African countries don't have the luxury of energy transition. We don't have that. That's a luxury. UK and Norway and all of these countries can play. They can scream energy transition as much as they want. Carbon capture and storage, the conversations have gotten more complicated. Hydrogen, it's getting more complicated. What Africa needs is an energy revolution, not an energy transition. We don't have that luxury. We are dying. If I'm dying of hunger, I would have a revolution. I would do everything to strategize, to plan, to build, to train my family. I would do everything in the books. So we don't have the luxury of energy transition. We need an energy revolution because we have an energy crisis. It's not a transition game. Transition is such that you can take your time, you can build the capacity, you can build the knowledge because you already have something on ground. If it's climate change, you have resilient systems to combat it while you are still transitioning. Okay? If it's energy, you have the energy already in place. You have a mix already in place. You even have neighbors in Europe that can supply and support you if anything goes wrong. So, it can't be that bad. So you can afford to transition. But for Africa, our neighbors are not helpful. Countries within the continent are not helpful. Everybody is trying to survive. Survival of the fittest. Are you getting me? So when you're in that situation, in a dire situation, it's not about transition again. It is a revolution that you need to design. So you need to design an energy revolution system based on your consumption, because you need to control your consumption. You need to control your production, and you need to diversify. You need to have an energy technology revolution as well. You need to have an energy technology revolution, because that is why countries like China have gotten 80% of the offshore wind turbine industry from nothing. The technology revolution. They are producing everything now.
Yeah, and
so for me, these conversations are more than an academic exercise. It's not. I don't have these conversations for fun. When I have my conversations on Europe, it's academic. We are exploring. We are dealing with these issues, quite important issues. Don't get me wrong, but we are a bit more relaxed when we have this conversation. But for the African continent, it's not an academic. This is real life and death. And it makes the difference between life and death. Because if you don't get energy right, you don't get development right. If you don't get development right, you don't get the economy right. If you don't get the economy right, you don't get security right. If you don't get the security right, you don't get all the other things that requires the society to work right. And so you still have people going to Libya and risking their lives in the Mediterranean just to come to Europe.
Yeah, I mean, you say that we need energy revolution and not energy transition, which I quite understand. And even for energy transition, you also say that we need to build capacity, right, to have energy transition. And right now, Nigeria does not have renewable energy infrastructures. Even the grid that we have may not even sustain, additional load to it. And to have renewable energy infrastructure, that requires lots of capital. And Nigeria's security situation in Nigeria is a very dire situation. So how can we attract, investment and personnel to be able to catapult this? So I'm afraid it's going to have to be a baby steps unfortunately. So how do we attract investments and personnel to be able to facilitate this, the infrastructure that is needed to be able, because you can generate energy, but we still need somewhere to store it. You can generate energy from solar, we still need somewhere to store it. You can generate energy from wind, but we still need grid, national grid, where it has to go through. Even though I'm proposing decentralized energy, where like a block of, this village will have their own small hydro or small wind, which is a way to start. So how do we attract investments and personnel considering the state of the country?
All right. So I'll tell you a few things. One, Nigeria has a lot of money. That country is rich. So it has a lot of money to waste. So if we plug the waste, right? Because if you're having a crisis and you're having a revolution, it can't continue to be business as usual. In that case, you even lose goodwill. If you're saying you're broke and yet you're holding on to the Range Rover that you spend the night in and all of that, and then you go to a friend's house and you have lunch, and you go to another friend's house and you have dinner, they wouldn't take you seriously because you're still driving a 2020 Range Rover. So you begin to cut costs in areas that needs to be cut. You plug all the waste in areas that needs to be plugged. And then you may begin to get a bit of goodwill. Say, do you notice that, these guys have cut this, they've cut this. Their senators now earn, way less. The president cut this. During COVID, most of us, the senior staff, from the principal to the senior management team, they had their salary, they volunteered to have their salaries cut.
In the University of Aberdeen.
In the University of Aberdeen. They said, please, can you cut our salary by XYZ? Because with COVID, we don't know what the numbers will look like. We don't know. And everyone like, whoa. They volunteered to have their salaries cut. And that was a gesture that demonstrated that even those at the top are willing to make sacrifices. So if we start seeing all these wastes being plugged, all the excess funds going to wherever they go to being capped and plugged as well. And then some of the funds from, these subsidies we've been making so much about that we really don't know where it is going, being, put into other channels, we may be able to get ahead. These are things that you can have a trajectory and say, if we do this, we will save X, Y, Z, and we will be able to put it in here. And people will see. Is again back to the issue of trust and transparency that I started talking about. People would see it. Now, there are other principles like energy democracy. So you need to democratize your energy system. And these are things that people are doing in Scotland, doing in Germany, doing in the US. You democratize your energy system in such a way that local communities begin to feel empowered to develop their own energy infrastructure. I remember when I was in Nigeria, when the transformer was bad, we contributed to buy, we contributed to, we were taking responsibility. And that's even how some, jurisdictions are operating. Even security, you see neighborhoods create their own, neighborhood watch, neighborhood security. Even when there are bad roads, they come together, they contribute and they build the roads. So it's not impossible to democratize your energy system in such a way that people would actually start owning their own energy sources. Or they already spend so much buying, independent generators and all of these things. So we could channel those resources and give people a system that would, if a community think that they would be able to raise the money to build a wind turbine that would power, 1,000 homes in a certain way, then they will do it. And we are seeing it being done here. And if they feel empowered, they may even have excess and sell to others. And it will create jobs and it will solve the energy security concerns. So you would see that some of the very wealthy people in maybe Lekki or in some of these other, highbrow areas will democratize themselves and build a system, and then they don't need the energy that they were ordinarily getting before, and then it then becomes available for other people who may not be able to democratize. And then that's how you try to balance the system here and there. It will get you somewhere. And the research can be done to say, if we democratize the system, how much can we get from here? How much can we get from here? How much can we get from there? And you would see that in 5-10 years, you will be heading somewhere. I'm not saying it will solve all the problems, but it will be part of the solution. And once people see that, once these global financial institutions see that genuinely, they may begin to say, wow, these guys are onto something here. But if they don't see anything, if you're still living business as usual and making all the noise, and nobody's saying stop oil. Are you getting me? Some people argue as though countries in the West are saying, oh, nobody can control what you do with your oil. Nobody.
Yes.
So better these guys take it out. Just don't be silly. Yes, they might decide not to fund it. They might decide not to, they have the right to do what they want with their money. Sort yourself. Look inward. You said that. Look inward. It's like when they put a ban on Nigeria and this, and of course, there's a concern on equities and all those things. But that should remind you that nobody cares in reality. You can die for all they care. So solve your problems. Get up.
Yeah. And I'm always skeptical when it comes to regulatory policy solutions with regards to, in the Nigerian context, because law doesn't really mean that much, But I was wondering, all these solutions you're proffering, all these solutions you're listing now, whether that can be tackled or enforced or facilitated through policy solutions, or should it be like a grassroots movement, activism to force the government to take action? Look, we're going to start having a drought. We're going to start having, desertification. You have to do something, with regards to the environment. Not just the environment. While we're trying to do something for the environment, we're also diversifying the energy mix. We're also, creating energy security. We're also creating national security, as you referred it to national security. So which way do we approach this? Policy solutions or grassroots movement?
It has to be everything. I mean, if you looked at COP, you would see that, a lot of the drive, around climate change is being pioneered by young people, local communities. Some of them, nobody has heard of, communities living in the coastline, all of those things. You could see that. From COP, we saw that quite strongly, and we heard those voices. And one of the strongest speech from COP was given by this lady who happens to be, I think, the Prime Minister for Barbados. One of the strongest speeches was given by her, if I'm right. And that's a country with barely a few 100,000 people. It's not a 200 million people like Nigeria or the US or most of it. So we are seeing a very strong movement from local participation, and that's informed by this broader energy justice discussions that we are beginning to see. We are seeing young people drive climate change. We are seeing NGOs sue multinational companies in the Netherlands, in Germany, in the UK. They're driving the conversation. So it's not gonna be this or this, but it will send us back to what I started from. Every government is based on trust and sincerity. If people have trusted the government to do certain things, they've given them that power to do those things. And a government should feel responsible and responsive to those people. That's not something law does for you. It's on the basis of that trust that you then have, a legal system, you then have, elections and all of those things. If those things were not there, then you don't have all these other things. Now, it may not be elections. Dubai is not a democratic, the UAE is not a democratic system in the sense that we know it. A lot of countries that are doing well is not really about, but is about being responsive and understanding and recognizing the trust that has been imposed or posed on government, whatever that government is. Okay? So we then need to check ourselves and ask ourselves fundamental questions of, do we think that this government is responsible and responsive on the basis of the trust we've handed over? If the answer is in the affirmative, and then we go ahead. If it's not, then what do we do about it? So it's not a one size fits all, or this is one solution. We will need to do everything within our power. And you remember, law can only do so much. There are things law can do, there are things law cannot do. Law has its own limitations. And in fact, law is basically an instrument of social engineering that makes society work as it should. It's not the reverse. So it means that society has accepted that this should happen, and then law is put in place so that it reminds people of what that agreement was. It's like a contract. You and I need to first agree that we are going to have this meeting, we are going to have this conversation, and we're going to do this for XYZ number of minutes and cover a number of issues. We needed that before. Maybe if we wanted to put a contract together, we go ahead and put the contract. The contract is law. The thing had already been agreed even before, we put the contract to paper. So that's the role of law. So we don't need to, we need to be mindful of, are we asking too much of a regime or a principle that can only do so much? Law would say don't kill, but people who would kill will still kill. But the law is there to kind of resolve that in a number of ways. So I think fundamentally people within the African continent need to start looking at their leaders. And again, I repeat, these leaders do not come from the sky. They come from within, the system. They come from you and I. They were living on our streets. They were living, they were next door neighbors. They were not too far away. And we need to ask ourselves, what happened? What went wrong in such a way that these people have now become, gods unto themselves? And on that basis, every other thing, fabric of society, within the energy structure, within the governance structure, is failing.
Throughout the course of this conversation, you mentioned gas flaring, and according to PwC, Nigeria ranks in the top 10 gas flaring countries with 7.4 billion cubic feet of gas flared in 2018. So I just wanted you to elaborate a little bit what this gas flaring is all about, and what's the purpose of it, because it's pretty much a waste, in other words.
So gas flaring in itself is done, again, this is largely technical, but gas flaring is not unusual. During the course of operations, for safety reasons and a number of other factors, companies may flare. All right. But it's structured, is regulated. You cannot flare, till infinity at will. You flare in such a way only to the level that is prescribed for safety reasons and all of that. So they might need to flare just to, let go of some of the excesses for a particular reason. But advanced systems have designed these things to, utilize the gas. So you see gas reutilization policies and schemes and regimes to ensure that the gas is reutilized, is reinjected, and is used to power, homes and heat homes and provide energy and all of those things. Now, for countries that flare gas at will, it's because on one hand, the penalties for flaring within the regulation is almost nothing. And so it makes more economic sense in a way to flare the gas and pay the penalties, because the laws were written God knows when, back in time when, they thought that was the way to go. And so it no longer serves as a deterrent, because it's more expensive to set up the infrastructure to reinject the gas. And then, of course, we all know that now significantly contributes to emissions and all of those things. So the whole idea is that hopefully countries that flare will begin to redesign gas reutilization policies and regulations in order to limit gas flaring, and again increase penalties for that. But you see, it's one thing to say all of these things if we're working or looking at a system that is effective or is designed as it should be, because when you have issues of conflict of interest and the regulator not having the capacity, the expertise, the knowledge to regulate some of these issues, then you find out that the regime is captured. So that leads you to what we call regulatory capture, in which case the regulated is more powerful than the regulator. And so, if he doesn't have the capacity and he's dependent on the companies to provide, maybe the materials or whatever he needs to be able to determine, how much gas is flared, how much, all of those things. If he doesn't have the capacity to identify those things, then how will he even enforce it in the first place? So, that's what happens with gas flaring. So, I have a friend who had done extensive research, Dennis Otiocho, on gas flaring in Nigeria and in Niger Delta region. But by and large, summarily, that's the whole idea behind gas flaring.
Okay, so obviously you've seen a lot of contracts with regards to oil and gas, extraction. Whether it's a production sharing agreement or service agreement. So I was wondering what roles oil companies can play, currently in Nigeria or other African countries in energy transition. Should there be like a clause in the production sharing agreement? Because I think you mentioned something with regards to the Norwegian 10 commandments, where they said, investing in other sector, you're using money to invest in somewhere else. Should there be a clause in that production sharing agreement to say, okay, 5% of your profit should go to R&D, research and development with regards to renewable energy in the country? Things like that. Could that be feasible?
Production sharing contracts already have those instruments. They'll already have those clauses for local content development and all of those things. And some of them even have clauses where the companies will be required to build, schools or training colleges and all of those things, or train an XYZ number of people within, a particular amount of time. It's all dependent on what you negotiate. And a contract is such that you can put anything inside it. It's a contract. It's you and I. It's what are we willing to do. And if you say a certain percentage of our profit, considering that, some of the countries may have their own national oil companies and may be part of the joint venture agreements and all of those things, then it means they are equally contributing as well. So if you say a certain percentage of your profit should be channeled towards, developing other energy, structures and all of those things, of course. But we're already seeing that with the companies. You're seeing, Statoil go from Statoil to Equinor. We're seeing, Total go to Total Energies. We're seeing boards of high-profile companies, including Exxon, being diversified or redesigned to take into account these same issues of energy transition. So it wouldn't be completely out of place for that if it's not already happening within that regime. So it's inevitable, and we're already seeing oil companies making that shift, making that move, not completely abandoning oil, but they are diversifying their portfolio. And that brings me to the point that there is an economic argument around, and if they were going to be losing money, they would not do those things. There is an economic argument around this issue. So, when some people make a fuss about, the West are trying to direct us and tell us what to do. No, this is as much an economic argument as it is for anything else. So where is the money? Where will the money be? And we're seeing companies, Tesla and all of those companies, changing the narrative and changing the game. So people are following the money. And if the money is in diversifying and developing other energy sources alongside what you traditionally have, then you're going to do that. And if everybody did that, then there would be a balance. We would be fine. Some will do it more than others, but at least there would be a certain level of engagement in the process.
Okay, I thought we end on this question, because I was wondering, energy transition in African countries or Africa as as a continent, whether it would be much better to do this on inter-country basis or even on a continental basis than each individual country is trying to, come up with some research and development or come up with some form of structure. I'm thinking, what would be the best way forward? Is it to do something on a continental approach? Maybe let's have a massive solar farm in Morocco, or something like that can.
I mean, there would be an opportunity because of how the countries are so structured. And we saw that with maritime boundaries. So when oil resources are straddling, different countries. So, Kenya and Somalia, Nigeria and Cameroon, the Bakassi Peninsula Rift, all of those things. When you have oil straddling two different countries, we have something called a joint development agreement where they sit together and say, well, we've got this oil in your side and my side. Is there any way we can design a joint development agreement and have a joint development zone of that area? And then we both issue licenses to a company and the company pays both of us, our share, and we both, rather than you taking from your own side and I taking from my own side, and because of how it's designed. And in the same way too, there's the potential that there would be opportunity to design a renewable energy or infrastructure that may cover, certain areas. The same way you would have road networks that will take you from Nigeria to Ghana or Benin or any of these places, even if they can be, you can have borders for those sort of things. But if you're developing and going offshore, and the technologies are advancing and all of that, and you need to do it within an area, and you cannot do it in one area. No, there's an opportunity for a regional approach to these things, absolutely no doubt. And again, the regional approach or an African approach provides a broader framework, either in terms of the financing, either in terms of the support schemes, all of those things. But I think by and large, individual countries will need to take certain responsibility. But because we all have different capacity, it may be better for a big country to build the infrastructure and then support, all the other smaller countries and things like that who may not have the resources or capacity. So it's that kind of thing. It's like the way, you would first rent a house before you buy one, that kind of thing. So if the infrastructure can be built in Nigeria and they can supply electricity like they do in some cases even now to neighboring countries, and there's a African framework or a regional or a sub-regional framework that enables them to do that, by all means, let's just do all we can. Internationally, as we see it in some of these international instruments, regionally or from a continental basis, as we can, and then sub-regional, regional, as well as national. So it has to be, every level, and even local community, even within the national, it should be up to the grassroots. So it's covering the entire spectrum. And hopefully with that, if we're able to galvanize that level of engagement, that level of support, that level of contribution at all these levels, you would see that you would be reaching the sort of the targets that are intended. Because if you democratize the system, it means that people are at the local level able to make use of their resources, contribute and develop their own energy infrastructure and power. At the state level, the same thing is happening. States are also, beginning to design and build and all of that. At the national level, things are also happening. By the time you put all that together, we will be getting somewhere. And that's why, like in the EU, you have the EU Green Deal. That's the EU designing an EU-wide framework that would be able to be harmonized so that if a company comes into that continent, it's working under one umbrella or one framework, and it's not going here and it's a different deal, and it goes there, it's a different deal, and it goes here, it's a different deal, and all of that. So you have a fragmented regime in that kind of process. They have something that provides them some level of uniformity and consistency, and hopefully, it does, achieve the sort of results that one envisaged.
Dr. Eddy Wifa, thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure. I didn't know the time was going so fast, but when you start this conversation, you just get sucked in.
Yeah.
But thank you. I appreciate all the effort, and I thank you for inviting me.